Good afternoon, everybody. I want to welcome you to this afternoon's discussion, which is entitled Schools and Communities, Antagonists or Allies in School Reform. This forum this afternoon comes at the end of a day-long workshop which has been going on over at the Faculty Club on Beyond Innovation, Sustaining What Works at the School-Community Intersect. The workshop and the forum have been sponsored by the Malcolm Wiener Center for Social Policy, the Harvard Project on Schooling and Children, and the Harvard Project on Effective Interventions. As the moderator here, I want to especially thank and recognize Lee Shore, who's here in the front, whose new book, Common Purpose, follows up where her last book, Within Our Reach, left off. Those of you who either voluntarily or were required to read Within Our Reach know that Lee talked about what makes for successful innovations, and in that book talked a lot about interesting small-scale projects. Her new book talks about how you make systems change, and we especially want to recognize that. And we want to also recognize the contribution to the workshop and the forum of Lee's supporters who are supporting the dissemination of her work. I'm Mary Jo Bain. I'm on the faculty here at the Kennedy School, and I'm the co-chair of the Harvard Project on Schooling and Children. I'm going to be moderating this afternoon, and the format for the discussion this afternoon is after I frame the discussion a little bit, I'll introduce our four speakers. They will then each have 5 to 7 minutes to make opening remarks. We'll then have some discussion among the participants and then open up to questions from the floor, and we will close at 5:30. I thought I would frame the discussion by reflecting a little bit on some of the themes that came out of the discussion during the workshop today on schools and communities and the school-community intersect. The workshop brought together a wide range of participants, people who were teachers, people who were principals, people who worked in communities, people who worked in social services, random academics, all to try to focus together on kind of the really compelling question for all of us, I think, which is how can we all contribute to the well-being and successful development of children in our communities, especially those children who don't have all the advantages of living and growing up in better off areas. Now, there are obviously as many answers to that question as there are people who are ready to propose answers to it, but two interesting streams of thought emerged in the discussions today, and I'm going to frame them in a little bit more polarized way than they emerged, but because I think it's interesting. One stream that emerged today in the conversation was a stream that focused on school reform, improving the performance of children in schools, improving instruction to bring that about. A second theme focused on community partnerships and community building, building relationships between schools and communities. Sometimes those two themes emerged in an almost polarized way. One of the participants, for example, reported on school reform efforts which were very much relentlessly focused on instruction and on what went on in the classroom. And any interactions that the school and the teachers in the school had with the larger community were directly focused on what the parents, the business community, whatever, the social service agency could do to improve the learning of children. Other participants talked about how a prime role for their school was a community building role. One of the school principals on the forum, for example, talked a lot about how she spent much of her time developing a park in her neighborhood. That is, seeing the school as an institution in the community. Now, these two themes, these two groups of folks, school reformers and community builders, don't always talk to each other, which is one of the things we discovered today, and one of the things that was fun about bringing them together and giving them a free lunch so that they had to. And when they do talk together, they don't always agree. Now, we can deal with those kind of disagreements in a couple of different ways. One thing we can do is shout at each other and impugn each other's motives and say that you don't really care about children. And unfortunately, there have been in some of our efforts some history of that. But I think what we're trying to do in the workshop today and want to do in this panel as well is to explore the ways in which the different reform approaches can perhaps complement each other, can perhaps help us to understand better the strategies that need to be followed. So that's what we're going to be about today, is kind of seeing how schools and communities and intersections and partnerships of various sorts between them can work to improve outcomes. We have 4 terrific participants, and I'm very excited, and as I say, I will introduce all 4 of them, and then we will start. The first is Cosette Buckney, who is the Chief Education Officer of the Chicago Public Schools. Cosette has had her entire career in the Chicago Public Schools, starting off as an English teacher, moving to be a counselor, being an assistant principal, then a project manager, then chief of staff, and now Chief Education Officer, which is an enormous responsibility in a school district the size of Chicago. And as you know, the Chicago School District has been going through some quite dramatic restructuring, which I know Cosette will talk about. She has a doctorate in education from Vanderbilt University and did her dissertation on school and business partnerships in Chicago. Our second speaker will be Jeff Canada. Jeff Canada is the author of Fist, Stick, Knife, Gun, A Personal History of Violence in America, and he also received the Heinz Award in 1994 for his work as president and CEO of Reedland Centers for Children and Families in New York. He has a new book, Reaching Up for Manhood, which I don't have a copy of, which will be published in January of 1998. Jeff Canada has a reputation as an advocate and an expert on issues concerning violence, children, and community redevelopment. He's worked very much with the Beacon School program in New York, as well as other efforts in New York. Among his efforts are Reedland's Beacon School, the Harlem Peacemaker program, and Community Pride Initiative. Mr. Canada is also the East Coast Regional Coordinator for the Black Community Crusade for Children. He has on his vita, but he said I shouldn't mention it, that he also teaches martial arts and is a third-degree black belt. So I thought that was kind of fun. Our fourth speaker will be Ernesto Cortez, who is the Southwest Regional Director of the Industrial Areas Foundation. IAF is a nonprofit organization founded in Chicago by the late Saul Alinsky. Mr. Cortez, in 1974, put together a sponsoring committee and then organized the San Antonio Communities Organized for Public Service. That's COPS, the well-known, successful church-based grassroots organization of San Antonio's West and South Side communities. 1977, he worked in Los Angeles, California, where he organized the United Neighborhoods organization. Mr. Cortez moved to Houston in 1978 and founded the Metropolitan Organization, the Valley Interfaith Organization in the Rio Grande Valley of South Texas. He's been actively involved in school reform and has helped to organize projects that have resulted in a rise of student success. One gets the feeling from hearing about his career that he might not always have been the favorite person of teachers and principals in the areas in which he was working, but I will let him say more about that should he choose to do so. Our final member of the panel is Natalie Goodkin, who is currently a sophomore at Harvard College concentrating in chemistry. She is the co-chair of the House and Neighborhood Development Program, HAND, which is a house-based public service program for undergraduate students. What HAND does is to try to pair each Harvard residential house with a Cambridge public school and its community. Natalie herself tutors second grade students in an after-school learning center at the Fletcher School and has worked with Cambridge school volunteers to improve upon enrichment programs for students after school. So that's our panel. We will start now with Cosette.
Good afternoon. I'm certainly pleased to be here with this austere group. I got on the campus and I thought it brought me back to old days of being in school instead of being about school. So I certainly am appreciative of the audience today. I will say immediate apologies. Paul Vallis, who is our CEO, unfortunately was not able to make it. In fact, I was in Springfield, our capital in Illinois, at another superintendent's conference, and he said, no, you have to go to Boston because we had an unfortunate outbreak of meningitis in some of our schools. And as the CEO, he's very concerned about certainly the health and safety of our students. What I'd like to do is kind of take you back a few years in terms of setting the stage for how we got to be where we are, and maybe you were in the Amazon or in a cave or something those years and aren't aware of all the crazy things that were happening in Chicago. In 1988, we had an overwhelming call from the community, business leaders, parents, to do something about public education in Chicago. Secretary William Bennett had been to the school system a couple years before that and declared it the worst in the nation, and things had gone downhill rapidly. There had been a number of strikes, a number of problems. So we had a reform law in 1988 that developed a very hands-on approach with the community in our schools. And that was done through a process called local school councils. And these local school councils have a great deal of authority. There are 6 parents, 2 teachers, and 2 community members, along with the principal sitting on those councils. And in the high school, there's also a student that have the power to select a principal, not renew a contract of a principal, recommend that the principal be fired or removed, as well as approve the budget and programs in the school. So it's quite an important position to be on local school council in our school. In fact, they're almost akin to mini school boards. From that process, we had a number of changes in our school system, a number of turnovers of principals, a number of exiting people from our school system because there just was not the feeling that education was the main focus it should be. It was more community-based. And so therefore some antagonisms were developed, as well as the fact that our mayor really had no control over the school board. He had a very convoluted process of selecting school board members, and so that antagonism developed as well. However, we were expected to continue educating students. That continued to 1995 when, after more strikes, it was very evident that things had to change. And the state legislature in 1995 amended the reform law in 1988 and said that the mayor now would be totally in charge of the school system, be able to totally appoint the school board, put in an organizational structure that's very akin to a business structure, and have total responsibility. I think that was done in the attempt to place all the blame when everything continued to fail, and we have tried to take this lemon and make some kind of lemonade out of it. What we have done is put together a CEO that is very much a business-oriented, did not come from education, even though he has a background in teaching, a CEO who's responsible for running the school system, and a chief education officer akin to the former position of superintendent, and then other chiefs involving procurement, operations, and finance. We put together an education plan, and in light of what you're looking at, school community relationships, we did some other things that we felt were very supportive of our education plan. We have what we call a community of learners. Now that we have the whole resources of the mayor of the city of Chicago, then we have the Department of Health, the libraries, the police department, the fire department, you name all the agencies that work with the city that now work with us to help provide services that we can directly utilize in terms of assisting our children and our parents. We have worked on character education programs for our students. We have community service programs in our high school that's required, that's going into our new high school plan. We've developed relationships with the interfaith community. PTA and parent involvement is very strong in our schools. We even train our parents to work with our students who are not able to get to our schools in preschool because they don't have the space, or for whatever reason they have chosen not to. And we have parents involved and community involved in our safe passage, and that is making sure that students can safely get to school. So one of the things that's very evident is that not only are we focusing on academics, because that is extremely important, and you may have read in some of the articles across the nation about how we've stopped social promotion and how we've required students to go to summer school that have not been academically performing. We also realize there's got to be a collaboration between support systems from the community to provide the necessary impetus in some cases for these activities and programs to occur. So we have worked together in a collaboration. I do think that the most important thing I must say as a chief education officer, that everything must be supportive of education. We cannot look forward to student achievement in isolation in terms of what's happening in the school, not having some reflection on what happens in the community and in the city as a whole. And I think our mayor has emphasized that as well. So in light of all that, we emphasize academics, but we work collaboratively with the community, and I do think that even though there can be some very antagonistic moments, that we can be allies in that relationship. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Beacon Schools initiative in New York City. Beacon Schools really grew out of a phenomenon in New York City of children dying on the streets. For a number of months in a row in New York City, in the early 1990s when Mayor Dinkins was still mayor, children were being shot in the streets of New York City, and the citizens of the city began to yell, "Do something about the murders of children." From that initial outcry, the mayor decided that he needed to hire an additional 2,000 police officers. Many of us in the city said that the answer to dying children would not be solved by police officers by themselves. And indeed, if the mayor didn't develop a place for these children to be, rather than on the street corners, you could have all the police officers you want, but the children would still be in the direct line of fire. The mayor listened to those of us who were yelling about this issue and created what was called Safe Streets, Safe City, and became sort of coined in the press as the Cops and Kids program. It was the largest investment in police the city had made in quite some time, but what people don't realize, that was the largest investment in youth the city had ever done at one single time, $30 million. And so when people began to look at the plummeting crime rates in New York City and began to talk about what a wonderful job the police had done, many people failed to realize the original strategy to reduce crime called for better policing and places for children to be. And the one thing that Mayor Giuliani kept from the Dinkins administration was the Beacon Schools. What are Beacon Schools? They're public school buildings that are open. Ours, the one that we run, is open a minimum of 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. It is a place that has a range of opportunities for young people. We are there during the school day, afternoons and evenings and weekends, and we have tried to design programs that the community really needs, not that we wanted to come up with, that the community needs in order to support the kind of development that communities need to do. Now, I know that there's been a lot of talk about sort of the role of communities, the role of schools. Part of what I am hoping that Beacon Schools can do is something that some of you may have heard about. In New York City, there was this whole controversy with our chancellor, Rudy Crew, because elementary school decided they did not want to lose an elementary school teacher, and they came up with the $40,000, right, to pay for this teacher because they didn't want to see their class size go up. And the parents came up with their own money, and the chancellor said, geez, you know what, you can't do that because people who live in rich parts of New York can't support schools where people, and he made a convincing argument, and the outrage of those parents was so strong, he had to back up, right? That to me is good school reform, right? When the community demands, and even the chancellor who has the law on his side cannot resist the power of community when it comes together to fight for its children. That's the point, I think, in rebuilding community and why the schools are a central place for this to happen. Let me tell you another reason that this is absolutely essential to me, that schools become places of community development. A lot of us who care about community development in general and rebuilding communities and taking poor communities that have really suffered over the last couple of decades and trying to figure out how you rebuild those infrastructures so that those places become better for children. One of the things I noticed among my own staff, very progressive, dedicated people, when their children became of age, they put all of their children in private schools. And I was like, what is this about? I mean, my kids are going to public schools and you all working, but why are you putting your kids in private schools? And they all looked at me and said, with my children, I take no risk. It's not about politics, it's not about my beliefs, it's about what I believe is the best for my child, and I don't believe in these public schools. And then that was the first thing that happened. Then let me tell you the second thing that happened. After a while, when they couldn't afford it, right, I didn't pay them any more money. They began to move out of the community. And I said, wait a second. You cannot rebuild community if the schools are lousy. People simply will not stay. The same people who ought to have their kids in elementary schools, these would be the people who would be going to the Little League, doing the after school, going and voting at the school. They are leaving because they can't afford to pay private school prices and live in the city. So they move to places where the schools are better. All of us who care about community building have to care about what happens in the public schools. You cannot rebuild community if the strength of your community gets drained away as people have children and move away looking for better education for their children. So what we've tried to do in Beacon schools is to really support schools. And it's the kind of support that I think all of us know children need. But the more, I think, sort of unusual thing in the Beacon schools is we've developed a range of supports for children, recreational, educational, counseling supports, but we also found that that was the perfect place to support their parents. Now, this was a big theory for us. We said, geez, would a child come to his place that his mother and father would go also, right? Some of you who have children know there's a certain point in time where they don't want to be seen with you under any circumstances out in the street, right? And we didn't know if the children would actually come to the same school that their parents were in, but we found if we designed places so the parents were on one floor and the young people were on another, this was the perfect place to rebuild community. Let me tell you what would happen in the Beacon schools. Young people would be there, they'd be off the streets, they'd be engaged in all kinds of supportive educational activities. We have a newspaper that young people started. They have their own TV, cable show. They're taking this stuff seriously, these young people do, and they're learning all at the same time, very much in support of what's happening in education. But their parents are there at the same, I see that, don't worry. I got my eye, I knew I was going on. The parents are there at the same time working on things that they care about. And we have parents, not 5, 10, 15, we have parents by the hundreds coming out, taking aerobics, taking African dance, being part of video workshops. What happens in the community when you suddenly have hundreds of people out walking around in the evenings? It changes how that community feels. Suddenly people are saying, you see 5 kids on the street, you say, geez, look at those kids, I want. Suddenly you have 15 adults walking. Those are just young people again. You begin to learn that they are your neighbors' friends, and you begin to realize that these young people are connected to this community, and you bring the strength of the community together to start working to rebuild that community. Beacon Schools, I think, is one way of blending this issue of community development and school reform at the same time. I don't think either one works by itself. Thank you.
Good afternoon. First of all, I'm very glad to be here. I'm personally and publicly committed to both organizing broad-based community organizations, but also to public education. I have a daughter who is an elementary school teacher in the Austin Independent School District, and I have 2 children, well, another daughter who just graduated from Albert Sidney Johnston High School in Austin, Texas, and I have a son who was going to Lyndon B. Johnson High School in Austin, Texas, but came with my wife and I kicking and screaming to Cambridge Ridge and Latin, okay, where he currently is attending school because his father, unfortunately for him, from his perspective, is currently a visiting professor at MIT. But at any rate, that's a personal matter. But as some people think today, some of these personal issues tend to get public and political, and because of that, I have a very deep personal concern about public education and its future. I happen to believe that schools can be very good because I happen to have experienced enormous numbers of teachers and principals and parents who are committed to school reform. The IF network in the Southwest got involved in public school reform issues through the question of public school finance. The COPS and Valley Interfaith organizations spearheaded an effort on the part of the IF organizations in Texas to get involved in equalization aid to public schools. And we got involved in a kind of a dubious relationship with a fellow by the name of H. Ross Perot, and which produced a very beneficial impact on the state of Texas. Sometimes people do the right thing for the wrong reason, which is one of the tenets of the IF organizations. And Mr. Perot used to tell some of his friends, you know, when they asked him why was he so involved in public education, he said, well, I know you don't like black. And I don't know if you ever heard, I can't do Mr. Perot's voice like Molly Ivins can, but, you know, he has a kind of a squeaky voice. Anyhow, and I know you don't like browns, okay, but I know you love green, okay, and if you want to make more of that green stuff, you're going to have to get involved, you know, in public education in Texas. Anyway, they did, and he did. But he wanted something different than we wanted. He wanted a business-run enterprise. He wanted a business-run managerial structure for the State Board of Education. We wanted equalization. So we kind of negotiated a deal, and in the process, we were able to successfully, with the help of a few other folks, like the Lieutenant Governor and the Governor, pass House Bill 72, which got over $1 billion of new money for a property-poor school district in the state of Texas. Now, that was real good. Unfortunately, the equalization and adequacy, commitment of the state to equalization and adequacy kind of sputtered. But I want to say something real quickly here. Money matters. Money matters. Money matters. But money is not the only thing that matters. Because what we found out was that even though school districts in Texas were getting new monies, not much was happening as a result of the increase in funding. Because we found out that it doesn't do a lot of good to reduce the classroom size from 30 to 12 if the teacher is still teaching the 12 kids in the classroom the same way she taught the 30 or the 35 kids, okay? So money is not the only thing that matters. You've got to do some other things, okay, which in school reform issues. And one of those other things that we think is real important is to create these communities of learners. Now, we do it a little bit differently than Mayor Daley does, okay? Because we like to do it from the bottom up. That is to say, we think that parents really do care about their kids. As my friend Hank Levin says, they don't have another set of kids that they're holding back, okay? They're giving you their best set of kids, okay, in the schools, okay? So they really do care about those kids. And in fact, we found that in schools all across the state of Texas, starting in Fort Worth, Texas, with Morningside Middle School, which was given, unfortunately, because it was the worst performing school in middle school in Fort Worth, Texas, had police calls every day, shootings, all that kind of stuff, all the horror stories that you can talk about in schools all across the country. They gave because Morningside was doing so poorly and was performing so badly, and the teacher morale was so bad, they gave them the most inexperienced principal that they could find, okay, a woman by the name of Odessa Raven, who took the job because she wanted to be a school principal. And she had a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of zeal, a lot of energy, but she wasn't too successful at first, he would say. She tried to get the churches involved. She tried to get the parents involved. She tried to do all kinds of things which would make a difference. Unfortunately, they didn't work very well. So Mrs. Ravens got connected to the IAF organization in Fort Worth called Allied Communities of Tarrant and began to develop a collaborative relationship. And I know my timekeeper is going to interfere, you know, if I tell you the story too long, and that's appropriate, that's what her job is, okay, to hold me accountable. But anyhow, what began to happen is after doing lots of individual meetings, house meetings, all the kind of, you know, began to develop, identify, test out, and develop leaders. We began to move, build a constituency of parents and teachers and community leaders and congregations which was connected to Morningside Middle School, where they'd only get 5 to 7 parents to show up for the open house. They got 900 parents to show up after 3 years of organizing. They went from being dead last in middle schools to being the number 3 middle school in Fort Worth, Texas, and their achievement levels are still going up. Now, the experience of Morningside led us to begin to try the same kind of organizing experience in Austin, Texas, where, again, we had the experience of a very poor-performing elementary school called Zavala Elementary School, which had a brand new principal, a fellow by the name of Al Melton, who again was given this opportunity to be a principal. Zavala was the worst performing elementary school in Austin. It was considered Siberia. It was the dumping ground for inexperienced or bad teachers, okay? They had a teacher turnover ratio which almost was 50%. But the parents thought it was a good school. Why? Because their kids were coming home with A's and B's. Why? Because they had a peculiar way, this is not going to work. Okay, I'm just sorry. Okay, they had a peculiar method of grading, all right? That is to say, if the kids were performing at a 2nd grade level and they were in a 5th grade classroom and they were doing well, they would get A's. Okay, anyhow, so Mr. Melton had the courage to tell the parents the truth. So he convened, with the help of Austin Interfaith, the prodding of my wife, and the organizer of the Austin Interfaith organization. They convened a meeting of parents and teachers, and they told the parents the truth. That meeting produced what our British friends would call a slanging match. It created a lot of tension, a lot of controversy. But after the controversy settled down, they began to do some organizing and began to do the individual meetings, the house meetings. They organized an after-school program, immunization clinic. They found out that no Zavala kid had ever gone to the magnet school that my son went to, the magnet academy that my son went to. So they worked a collaborative relationship with the University of Texas and created a young Zavala science program. Now there are 20 Zavala kids going to Keeling Middle School. As a result, Zavala is today a blue ribbon school. And more importantly, now that Mr. Melton is a middle school teacher and making that an alliance school, 4 Zavala teachers are now principals and now are organizing alliance schools. There's now a network of 19 alliance schools in Austin. There's about 120 in Texas. They're devoted to 3 very important things. Number 1 is to create a powerful constituency in support of educational reform, because money matters, and you're going to have to pay teachers if you want to get good, if you want to keep good teachers and recruit new teachers. Money matters, but more importantly than that is you've got to change the culture of schools. You've got to move from what we call a bureaucratic, hierarchical, top-down, unilateral power culture to one which is much more relational, collaborative, where there's interaction between parents and teachers, where there is this communities of learners. And third, which is real important, we think you've got to connect the culture of the school to that of the congregation, that of the community, to begin to recreate a civic culture. You're going to have to begin to do some constant reorganizing, which requires agitation, challenge, but you're going to also have to recognize that there is going to have to be, at some point, a political struggle in behalf of schools, which means we're going to have to take parents and teachers and community leaders and turn them not into clients, but into citizens who understand that they have an active and responsible role to play in mobilizing in behalf of school reform. Thank you very much. A lot more I'd like to say, but we're out of time.
By the way, Ernie, I think the time when I was held most closely to a time limit was at an IAF organized rally. So.
Hello, I am honored to be here, and I must say I was a little surprised to have been asked, given the credentials of everyone else who is here. But I do feel that my experiences can lend insight into how volunteers can positively impact the role of education in the community. As a freshman in high school, I started volunteering regularly for a program that provides athletic activities for children with Down syndrome, primarily. Some of the kids had autism, but it was primarily kids with Down syndrome. I volunteered and worked for this program during high school and during my first year at Harvard. And then last year, as my second year started at Harvard, I became involved with HAND, the House and Neighborhood Development Program. I am a tutor at the Fletcher Grammar School, and I'm the co-chair of this program now. However, before I tell you about HAND, I want to tell you a story that I really sort of feels exemplifies how public service can impact the lives of people. 4 years ago, my older brother Graham decided he wanted to become a big brother. He was paired with a 10-year-old boy named Robin, who lived 4 blocks from his dorm room at Columbia University in New York. Robin had been diagnosed with severe learning disabilities, and he was struggling in school. Graham and Robin became fast friends. I remember visiting Graham his freshman year in New York, and he wanted me to see everything that there was to see, but most importantly, he wanted me to meet Robin. And in the few months that they had known each other, they had sort of formed a bond that threatened my 18 years of being his only sibling. Last fall, Robin started 8th grade. Over time, his grades had dramatically improved, and his parents were getting a little bit concerned because his high school did not have a very good reputation and was not in a safe neighborhood, and they were concerned that he would get lost once he started his freshman year. Graham and Robin's parents sat down and spoke for a long period of time about the different types of magnet schools that Robin could apply to as a freshman in high school. Robin applied, and he was accepted at 2 schools. He chose to attend the one that focused on economic development and sort of learn more mathematic type stuff. He had an enormous amount of anxiety about school and his new friends, but he's just completed his 5th week, and he is thriving at his school. Graham and Robin still see each other regularly, even though they have both grown too old for the program that originally paired them. Both boys gained a great deal from this experience. Robin was able to step through the gates of Columbia and see the opportunities that awaited him in the academic world. Graham was able to step outside of Columbia and discover Puerto Rican culture through attending parties and dinners with Robin's family. Robin's education is headed in the right direction. He loves his new school and he is working hard. Graham will be a much, much more understanding parent from this experience. But most importantly, they both gained a lifelong friendship. Uniting a community across cultural and economic differences can be difficult, yet it is the most important role that community service can play. This is exactly what HAND strives to achieve. HAND aims to build a partnership between Harvard and the City of Cambridge by pairing each residential house with a Cambridge public grammar school. Most houses have 4 primary programs: a tutoring program, a reading program, a mentoring program, and a one-shots program. Tutors are sent either to help students during the day in one-on-one or small group environments, or they help students in an after-school learning center. Last year, HAND started running America Reads, which allows work-study students to tutor in elementary schools as their term-time job. This year, with the help of many teachers and administrators in the Cambridge schools, HAND has developed a reading curriculum in order to provide more intensive work in the after-school program. Harvard students can also serve as a mentor to a Cambridge student by spending 4 to 6 hours per week with a child. This relationship is not academically based, but rather focuses more on improving self-confidence and fostering a lifelong friendship like the one that Graham and Robin found. Many mentors take their mentees to Harvard museums, show them around Boston, or kick a ball around the quad. Our 4th program, One Shots, provides Harvard students who cannot make a regular commitment to public service with an opportunity to get involved at a minimal level. The most famed of the HAND One Shots among the children of Cambridge are the annual Halloween parties, which involve trick-or-treating in haunted houses, which are known to be so scary, often the children won't go in. Despite the fear of the haunted houses, however, HAND Halloween parties are a high point for the children and are discussed for months to come. Well, these are the 4 primary programs that HAND runs. No house is alike. Each house has different needs, and each school has different needs, and each house has different resources. For instance, Elliott House is known for its Girl Scout troop, and Kirkland House is known for its after-school soccer league. Perhaps what is best about HAND is that it provides an opportunity for any student to get involved with the Cambridge community in any way they choose. When I got involved with HAND last fall, I knew nobody else who was involved with the program. Currently, 3 of my roommates, my chemistry lab partner, and 5 of my closest friends are all volunteering for HAND. Many of them started with no long-term intention, roped into a day of service by me or others, yet they are all still volunteering. HAND is set up in a way that students truly can volunteer with their friends and make each project a group effort. Students who once saw public service as an added bonus on their college application get involved with HAND and realize that volunteering can be beneficial for both parties. It becomes a chance to laugh with children, teach them to read, and tell knock-knock jokes they had forgotten years before. HAND has approximately 700 volunteers, and I sat down with a few of them and tried to brainstorm reasons why we thought HAND was particularly successful for students. First of all, HAND will accept any amount of service, 15 minutes to 40 hours a week. Students are spread thin, and they need to be given a way to continue to serve without giving a huge time commitment. If they like their 15 minutes, they'll come back for more. I know I certainly did. Volunteers need confirmation that they make a difference. By having continuing relationships with children, volunteers can see them grow throughout the year. One Shots should have a culminating moment, when the students can express their thanks. Most importantly is that volunteer appreciation is key. In college settings, parties and food are big draws. So having volunteers work together on projects can also make the projects more enjoyable for students and the volunteers. Teamwork gets us everywhere. Not every community has a Harvard or a Columbia, but every community has a high school, and many have community colleges. In every community, there are ways to build programs that are successful at reaching children. HAND was conceived of 15 years ago, and since then it has grown into an extraordinary program. What started as one person with a vision has grown into hundreds of Harvard students and has impacted many, many more Cambridge school children. I believe that the way to prepare our educational system for success in the 21st century is to build the surrounding communities into closely knit networks which can then provide support and encouragement at every educational level. Thank you very much.
to start off the discussion by asking each of our panelists to the same question, actually a couple of questions, and ask them to think about it from their different perspectives. And my question comes from the experience that was reported by one of the panelists in the workshop today, but also referred to by Ernie Cortez, of a principal coming into a school which by nearly every indicator that you could look at was doing poorly. Some of the indicators that were mentioned, this was a controlled choice situation that she was reporting on, and nobody chose it. The parents didn't come to parents' night. The test scores were low. The community wasn't involved, and so on. Principal, this is not an unusual situation, and what I wondered if each of you would comment on, and Jeff, I'd like to start with you and then go kind of that way, is what advice would you give that principal about the most important things to do first? Somebody coming into that kind of a situation, how do you think about it? What do you do first?
Well, I think the thing that I would suggest right away is the principal really needs to do an asset inventory of the community. Schools should not think that they have to provide every support that young people need. I think they need to coordinate to make sure young people get what they need. But the important thing, I think, for a new principal is to really go out and talk to people in the community, get to know the community, get to know what's out there for young people, and invite those services in to be part of a collaborative in rebuilding sort of the relationships that school has with the community. I'll tell you, I think it's probably easier to tackle that issue with the new principal, and we certainly have found it so, than if you've had a principal who's been in a school for 15 years and that school has failed for 15 years to come in and get that principal to understand there's something wrong with the way he or she is acting and they need to change and reach out some more. So I think that if you can get that person out to talk with folks in the community, understand what's out in the community, and bring those resources into the school in a collaborative way, that would be helpful.
Well, the first thing I'd ask the principal to do would be to go to IF 10-day training, okay? Because he or she is going to have to learn how to be an organizer. And what I mean by that, he or she is going to have to learn how to identify, test out, and develop leaders. Leaders among their teaching corps, because what's going to be real important is that principal be able to identify those teachers that have relationships with other teachers, those teachers that can help create what we're calling this community of learners. The principal is going to have to be able to identify talent among parents, and the principal is going to have to be able to identify talent among congregational leaders, pastors, priests, settlement house leaders, et cetera, et cetera. Because what's going to be real important, I think, is that principal then creates what we call an organizing team. 18, 12, 15 parents, teachers, principals who come together not to be gatekeepers, not to be a school board, not to stop other people from participation, but see themselves as agitators. And by that I mean to stir up people's values and their vision and their imagination. The values and the vision, the imagination of the congregations, that they begin to see that they have a role in this. The values and visions of parents, they begin to see that they have a collaborative role. The values and visions of teachers, because they need, and one of the most important dimensions of the school reform initiatives that we've done, and particularly in high schools, have been the maintenance people, the people who work in the cafeterias, the people who are involved in maintaining the school grounds. They've got to be part owners of this. And of course, obviously, there's going to have to be some kind of shared power structure going on inside the classroom, because you're going to have to create a different kind of teaching. People like Dick Bernane and Frank Levy have written eloquently about teaching the new basic skills in their book, where they talk about that if in the 21st century, kids are going to have to learn how to be collaborative, have to learn how to be initiatory, create new knowledge, all these kind of things. Well, the question I want to ask you is, how is it possible for kids to learn those kind of skills if the teachers don't have those kind of skills? And where do the teachers learn how to be collaborative? Where do the teachers learn how to create new knowledge? They certainly don't do it in most schools of education in Texas. Maybe they do at Harvard. I don't know. The only place I know that they learn those kind of skills are in broad-based organizations where they have to learn how to negotiate and collaborate, etc. And I'm sorry I went so long.
That's terrific. You're doing great. Natalie?
I can only sort of relate this to hand, and the biggest problem that we have is sort of informing parents about what the tutors are doing with their children, especially when tutors are working one-on-one. And the way that we really try to encourage the tutors to reach the parents is to send home letters with their children when they go home at the end of the day, where the child has written a letter about what they're working on, and the tutor has then written a letter about, sort of what the student has learned during that time period, and then asking the parent if they could please get together to meet to discuss, how the child is improving in his or her work.
Okay, I know, Mary Jo, your question was what should the principal do first, but I'd like to step it back prior to that principal getting assigned there and say, what did that principal feel was his or her strengths to make them want to go into that school? I think it's very important for us to realize that every even successful principal is not necessarily going to be successful someplace else. You have to look at what your strengths or weaknesses are, what the needs of that community are, and how the two of them can match. I have seen many successful principals in one setting that we promoted to another setting that were dismal failures because they didn't do what the other two speakers mentioned. That was look at the assets and the needs in that community and see how they could provide for them. So I would hope that as communities select principals or superintendents select principals, that they do so with the knowledge of the strengths and weaknesses of the individual selected and what are the needs of the community that in which the school resides. Because if you don't have a match, then you will definitely have the antagonistic relationship that often exists in some of those schools and communities.
I want to ask another question, a similar question, and again ask everybody to comment. One of the points that Lee Shore made in her opening remarks today in reflecting on what she found in looking at successful innovations and successful programs was that the successful programs seemed to exist where there were people who were able to break the rules. I.e. that the most successful programs were one where people would kind of do things when the superintendent wasn't looking, or do things that kind of weren't quite within the rules. Lee then made the comment that if success requires breaking the rules, perhaps the rules ought to change. I guess I'd like each of our panelists, and I think I'll start this one with Ernie, since it's certainly not fair to start this one with Cosette, or maybe it is, to comment, both to comment on that, whether that has been true in your experience, and if it is true, what are the most important rules to change in order to make it easier for successful programs to exist?
Well, let me tell you a little story. After Al Melton had, in Zavala, had instituted a gifted and talented curriculum for all of the kids at Zavala, and after 200 Zavala parents and Austin Interfaith leaders went down to the school board to get the Zavala Science Academy started, he got a call from his boss. And his boss said, your parents are coming down to the school board all the time now. Okay, they're out of control. Rein them in. And Mr. Melton said, you're right. They are out of control, but there's nothing you or I can do about it, okay? And I'm not sure I want to, okay? Now, what Al has said is what he likes about the Alliance School Network is it gives him space, political space, and political space to break one of the rules. Because one of the problems with principals in Texas is they are compliance officers, okay? Their job are to dot the I's and cross the T's. My good friend Tom Luce keeps talking about that one of the reforms that we need to do is to make the principal the chief educational officer of every school. But then he always has this caveat, not yet, okay? And the reason the not yet is because right now they are compliance officers and they go to principal and superintendent schools taught by the Grand Inquisitor, okay? In Dostoevsky's famous novel, The Brothers Karamazov. I don't have time to go through that chapter. I'm sure everybody here at Harvard has read it, okay? But you know that the Grand Inquisitor thinks that adults are children, that they have to be taken care of, they have to be told what to do, and so the Grand Inquisitor operates according to this model of unilateral power. Well, we suggest that there's another model that principals and teachers ought to operate, which we call the Iron Rule, which is never do for anybody what he or she can do for themselves. And there's all kinds of people who illustrate the Iron Rule. Again, I don't have time to talk to you about them, but the main point is that if you're a principal or a superintendent, do not create dependency. Do not treat people as if they are helpless. Do not make adults incompetent, because one of the things that schools tend to do right now is to teach people to be helpless, to be incompetent, and to learn helplessness. Now, they're not the only ones who are guilty of that, okay? The corporations, the universities, the churches are all guilty, but we've got to break that mold of thinking of getting away from our institutions teaching people to be incompetent. And we got to break that rule if we're going to build successful communities of learners. Thank you.
I don't know too much about the rules of public schools, not having ever been an administrator in one, obviously. But as a first grade student, I continually failed every single solitary spelling test ever presented to me. And I would get my spelling test back, and I would sort of look at it, and then the teacher would come over and scream at me for 5 minutes about how could you have done this? You're obviously stupid. This is a horrible piece of paper. Or, you know, it's red everywhere. And I would cry, and then I was sent home. And my parents finally went in and said, something's not working. She obviously can learn how to spell boat, but she's not doing it. And the teacher said, well, she just cries. And my mother said, well, maybe if you don't yell at her so much, she won't cry. And this sort of went on and on and on. And I think a lot of time what gets lost is when you're sitting with a room full of 30 children, it's very, very hard to then react to each child individually. And I don't know, you know, it's a difficult balance to strike, but I think that's perhaps most important when you're looking at how schools should be work, is to make sure that each teacher understands the child that they're talking to.
Certainly, as the education officer in the school system, we make the rules and we expect people to follow them, but I can think not into the too distant past where I was a principal of 3 separate schools and spent a great deal of time breaking those rules. And we called it creative insubordination at that time. And we certainly, the one thing you have to learn to do with a very, very straight face is say, oh, I didn't know that was a rule. I'm sorry, I will never do it again. While you go forward doing what you need to do to make sure that you are meeting the needs of your community. And let me also say to you from both sides of this that if you are successful, and hopefully the majority of the time you will be, then people will forgive you for breaking those rules, as long as those rules don't involve money and those kinds of, you know, really, really nasty things. But you have to be able to decide whether the rule is more important than the goal you're trying to reach. If that rule is a barrier to the goal that you're trying to reach, and you have to find a way to get around it. And too often school systems exist to provide that framework in which you are to work, but don't realize that oftentimes that framework confines you in such a way that you cannot do the job that we at the same time are expecting you to do. So I think you need to get in your brain how to be creatively insubordinate in terms of making sure that the rules that exist are not such that prevent you from reaching the goals that you need to reach.
I think this issue of rules and who breaks them and who really doesn't really comes down to people who are willing to take risks for what they believe in. And when you're teaching and you're working with young people, it seems to me when you can really keep them and their education as your focus, you're willing really to literally do almost anything that you know helps those young people. And I see people do it all the time. What I think is really problematic with that, though, is that there is no incentive for those who will not break the rules, even when they know young people are failing en masse. And they are willing to just go along and sort of say, I'm doing everything that's in this handbook. So therefore, even if my young people are failing and have failed in this institution for years and years, that's perfectly all right. I think that's really much more the problem. I think that gets to the issue of what the rules are and who do the rules protect. And often it's not the children. Often the rules protecting people's jobs and other things. And I think that there really has to be an examination of sort of who we protect and what the rules are for. And I don't think we've done that in a long time.
I'm now going to stop dominating the discussion and open up to questions and comments from the floor. There's a mic on each side here. If you have a question or comment, come to the mic. It will be helpful if you identify yourself if you ask a question and keep the questions relatively brief. I especially want to invite the people who are participating in the workshop today to comment, ask questions, elaborate, and so on. So, and I'll just go back and forth between the two mics. So,
thank you, Mary Jo. My name is Tony Wagner. I'm president of the Institute for Responsive Education based here in Boston, and I've been a participant throughout the day in our conversations. I'm struck by the fact that throughout the conversations, rarely have we addressed the question of school-community collaboration for what? To what end? Is it a means or is it an end in itself? And I would like to respectfully try to answer that question and then invite each of you to as well. Is the collaboration a means to an end, or is it an end, and if so, what is the end? It is our experience in working with schools that most folks do not understand how the world has changed around them in the last quarter century. They do not understand what students need to now know and be able to do for work, for citizenship, for lifelong learning, and for personal growth and health. And they do not understand their new roles and responsibilities in helping young people to achieve these new competencies. So from my point of view, the school community collaboration has to be about understanding how our world has changed, what our students need to know and be able to do in that world, and what our respective roles and responsibilities must be to help those young people. I invite your comments.
Elaborations?
I'll be happy to. I believe that public education serves to provide the not only academic but social foundation to produce productive citizens. If that is what public education is about, then it certainly has to be a collaboration with the community, with supporting agencies, because otherwise you're going to create some very intellectual students, and I think that was brought in the previous forum, that cannot function in the outside world. And if they cannot function in the outside world, they cannot be productive citizens. The collaborations that we have in Chicago Public Schools serve to provide the support systems and the environment to help our children learn to do both, academically achieve, and that has to be a focus, because if we have children graduate from our school system that cannot be productive citizens because they can't read, write, compute, et cetera, then we have failed on that end, and that is the end that we are being paid to produce. However, we cannot produce it in isolation, and therefore it must be a collaborative effort.
Before other people answer, let me be a little provocative here. I learned this at IAF 10-day training. Things like training productive citizens are really terrific, but it's not something that, is it, that you can actually hold people accountable for? I mean, shouldn't we be really trying to focus on, reading scores are kind of the other extreme, but don't we really need to have goals that are expressed in ways that we can genuinely hold people accountable for?
Mary Jo, if you'd gone to the second week of training, which you didn't, you'd learned that there's a difference between agitation and irritation. Okay? And that the goal of an organizer is to agitate. Okay, but at any rate,
Am I irritating you?
No. I just wanted to have a chance at you. That's all. I wanted to get. Okay. I think you're right. We're told by all kinds of people that people will change jobs 11 times, 9 times, 7, whatever. I don't know the number. It keeps changing. Okay, it's a moving target during our lifetime. A way I've gotten, which helps me think about this, is that when I grew up, for most people who did not go to a professional school, that when they got a job, whether it was for the telephone company or IBM or the city of San Antonio or the city public service board, there was a career ladder. Once you got in the network, if you got into Kelly Air Force Base, there was a career ladder that enabled you to figure out, and there were people there who enabled you to figure out how you could be successful. When I grew up, there was 250 adults who were organized against me. Okay, they told me where to go, what to do, what to think, how to act. They had the right to challenge me, to chastise me, to punish me. They were part of an overlapping network of institutions: the Catholic Church, the neighborhood, the Democratic Party, labor unions, etc. Okay, we call those intermediate institutions. They don't exist anymore. Instead, when I started organizing in Los Angeles, we had 75 kids organized against their parents, and their parents living under house arrest, okay? So you got a totally different context in which you have to think about schools and the development of kids. So what we're trying to figure out is how do we create a different kind of intermediary which enables, and we talk about it in terms of both labor market, in terms of educational development, which enables kids to then negotiate, or enables communities to negotiate with employers and to begin to provide those career ladders. Now, I don't have time to go into the dimensions of those kind of intermediaries, but we think that schools, when I talked about this Alliance Schools as developing this civic culture, we think that the schools have got to be an integral part of creating those network of institutions, or revitalizing what the fragments of what used to exist, families, voluntary associations, congregations, et cetera, to create that different kind of intermediary. That's real important. The second difficulty we have is that we have this conflicting agenda. in school reform. Jerome Bruner has this book, The Culture of Education, and in it he writes a lot of various interesting stuff, most of which I agree with. And he talks about how we got these two basic conflicting truths, okay? Both of which are true, but they conflict each other. That schools are about developing people's capacities as individuals, as human beings, okay, to be able to develop and be productive in this 21st century, et cetera. So we're talking about enhancement, et cetera, and all these kind of goals that Mary Jo alludes to. But at the same time, we also know that schools historically have had this role of creating the kind of citizens who understands the democratic process, because there's no other place that I know of which teaches people the values and visions of a free and open society. Where do you learn how to be a citizen, okay? Where do you learn how to understand what the United States is all about, okay? And because we don't have institutions which teach us now what the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and due process and all these things are all about, we get distracted by tangents, like, well, maybe what holds us together is the English language, okay? When we know, in fact, that that's not what holds us together. What holds us together is our commitment to these democratic principles and Republican traditions, okay? And our commitment to this kind of understanding what it means to be a citizen who has not only rights but responsibilities. But where is the institution that teaches us ordinary people how to think about these things? And I'm saying is that institution has to develop habits of the heart, has to develop capacity, has to develop character in order for us, in the context of a community, in order for us to succeed as a democratic society.
Oh, I'm sorry, Jeff.
I just wanted to respond quickly. There are lots of communities around this country that were really slammed by a couple of major crises in the last 25, 30 years. The heroin epidemics really fractured a lot of a sense of community. There was lots of us who grew up I grew up in the South Bronx. It was a tough place, but we didn't have to worry about locking our doors. We weren't worried that people were going to sneak in our windows. We didn't have bars on our windows. We did not live in that kind of a world. You got the heroin epidemic. Quickly, that followed by the increase in murders with handguns and what happened with crack cocaine. You had communities that were totally fractured. I have young people who have grown up literally in a community that I know nothing about, that it doesn't parallel anything that's been in my existence, and that's the way they have grown up for the last 20 years. I think that one of the places that all of this stuff gets dumped in, and actually it often makes it worse, is in the public schools. And no one's figured out, teachers haven't figured out, things have changed, they're dramatically different. These young people have real different needs than we had when we were growing up. Everybody still needs to learn how to write and to read and to figure, but there's these other things that are pressing on these young people which we have to figure out a way, and there's no one there with the sort of skill set to help both groups sort of negotiate this. That's where I think this community and school piece really intersects. I think it has a lot to do with what you're talking about. I think there are reasons that things are very different right now, not that it was great back then, but there are real challenges, and I don't think that we have sort of adjusted our methods of dealing with this to really to deal with the challenges young people are facing today.
Thank you. I wonder if Cosette Buckney could explain something that I don't understand. In the Chicago schools, you had different people taking over...
Could you identify yourself, by the way? Sorry.
John Stern. You had different people taking over the administration of some of the schools, people who... In the instance I'm thinking about, Marva Collins took over several of your elementary schools.
Our probation managers.
Okay. And I heard something that I don't understand at all, that there was some kind of standardized test or some measurement on which the students in the schools that she had taken over tripled their score. This just doesn't make any sense to me, and I wonder if you could help me figure out whether, first tell me whether that's true, and what that means.
The part of what we did in the Chicago Public School System was start zeroing in our attention on the schools that were the worst performers. And what we did about a year ago, October of last year, was put 109 schools on what we call probation. That gave the school system the authority to go in, provide them with resources and support services, an external partner, which was usually someone from an institution or an educational organization that could provide some type of services, as well as a probation manager. Marva Collins was selected as a probation manager in several of our schools. The standard for putting schools on probation was that 15% or less of the students were at national norms. 15%, which means or less, which means 85% were not at national norms. Okay, so to answer your question very quickly, if you're at 2% and you triple, you're only 6%, and that still is not marvelous anyway. And yes, of course, it can happen. And if you have 600 students in a school and you zero in on those students who are closest to that 50% level, which is one of the things that Marva Collins used as her tactic, was let's work with the low-hanging fruit. That it was certainly, yes, it did happen. Was that marvelous? No, because they still are below 15%. But again, we are showing progress.
Thank you.
I'm Jim Tipton. I live here in Cambridge. 50 years ago, I had a little experience as a consultant with the schools of Chicago and New York City, and I'd be tempted to ask questions about them, but I won't. I will be more general. Question of maybe all five of you, in fact, that I'm interested in would be, how do you feel about the rather passionate effort of President Clinton to bring about standardized tests national for the 4th and 8th grade students? And a sub-question is, what would be connected with what you've been saying, which has been very stimulating to me, what would be an effective role of the federal government in addition to national tests, if any?
Who's willing to start on that one?
I will. Since I have recently had very firsthand experience with standardized tests, personally, I don't believe in the standardized test, and I think that it doesn't necessarily measure how much you've learned. I took the ERBs every year for 10 years, and then, all through high school, took many tries at the SAT and the PSAT. And those aren't necessarily, obviously, tests that are measuring what you've learned as more as what you're sort of apt to learn. But I failed every one of them. And I think that testing students doesn't necessarily measure what they've learned because there's a whole bunch of nerves involved. There's, pressure. The teachers have talked all year long about, in New York, for instance, the region exams, they've talked all year long about this, and it builds and it builds and it builds. And, our school reputation is based on the score. My, college office is saying, our matriculation is based on how you do on the SAT and where you get into school as a result of that. And I think that in a lot of cases, it can end up hurting the child so much that they will not perform on that standardized test.
I'll jump in on this one. I'm certain we've all heard the saying that weighing a pig does not make, measuring the pig's weight does not make it weigh more, okay? So I certainly understand the constant testing of students in no way improves the students' ability to show what they know or the fact that they know anything more. But it does give us a measure, and as long as we live in this society that constantly requires those test scores. You took some kind of test to get into Harvard, okay? And some students didn't get into Harvard because they didn't score as high as some of you did on those tests. We are constantly going to have to, as certainly a public education system, respond to the media's concern about the test scores of our students. That is how parents determine whether they want their child to go to a certain school. Therefore, do they want to live in that community? Do they want to live in that city? And as was mentioned earlier, parents move when they don't feel that the school is providing them the resources that they need for their child. In terms of the president's national test, Chicago did agree to participate in the test. We were asked if we would participate, and we certainly said we'd be more than happy to support the initiative. I, however, am very concerned that we don't get caught up in the act of testing so much that we forget about teaching, because if we spend more of our time giving the tests than actually looking at what our students need to learn, need to know what to do, be able to do to show that they become these productive citizens, then we've lost the purpose of schooling. And I hope that we can get through this whole process of it. This is only the president's recommendation, remember, is only 4th grade reading and 8th grade math. That's not going to kill any of us. I certainly hope it will not go further than that. But in terms of those two tests, I think they might be able to give us some kind of information that will be helpful. But again, testing is something the public asks for. They make determinations on what they feel about schools and school systems based on those tests. We might as well accept that reality.
Because in your answer to the previous question, it sounded as though you were using test scores in many ways as a management tool to identify low-performing schools and, really low-performing schools.
Absolutely.
What are the other ways you use test scores as management
we have a
tool?
number of indicators of whether students are performing, schools are succeeding. The attendance rate, the dropout rate in the schools, the parent participation in the schools. There are a number of things that you use to see how students are doing, but you have to remember the newspaper does not report those. The newspaper never says we have 100% participation of parents in an individual school. They do say, however, the students' reading scores in X school are whatever. And so therefore we have to be very cognizant of what is expected of us while we also are working with how we provide all the resources that are going to be necessary. Certainly a student is not going to do well on the test if they're not coming to school. So attendance is important. If a student drops out, if a student, our young ladies that get pregnant, a lot of support services are necessary to make students remain in school and feel that they are learning something in school. But again, if the end result is not performing on the test, then unfortunately, no one will believe that we're doing anything in the school system.
I hate standardized tests. I think they're the most incompetent way of measuring performance and achievement. But nonetheless, we have to live in the world as it is. In Texas, we are past masters at using tests in the most ridiculous ways possible. We have TOS days. We teach the tests. My daughter went to a school which was one of the highest, was teaching at a school in Fort Worth area, which was one of the highest performing schools in the state of Texas on TOS elementary schools. And all they did was teach TOS. They didn't teach history or math or science. They taught TOS, okay? Now, the theory is that if the test is a good test, okay, then teaching the test is okay. I guess so, but, you know, I'm just kind of overwhelmed with the fact that kids in Dallas, for example, who go to the elementary school, which is one of the highest performing elementary schools, the kids are bored, they hate school, they've cut out art, they've cut out music, they've cut out storytelling, they've cut out language, they've cut out anything which in any way would take away from teaching the test. The teachers hate it. Most of the teachers want to get out of teaching because there is, you know, they have these, there's just this enormous incentives to perform on TOS. Nonetheless, you know, one of the measures of the success of the Alliance schools is we've been able to get test scores up. Now, our theory is what we want to do is to get the test scores up so that we can then have the credibility to get permission from the school district to teach kids, okay? And that's basically what we're doing, okay? Now, I don't know if if the tests were good tests, I presume that they would be, and if they were used in a way not to beat kids over the head, but to indicate areas where we ought to be working with kids, I think they would be useful. But I don't know if we have the capacity or the wisdom to do that kind of stuff. So I'll be ambivalent.
I think that there's a real problem because we want our teachers to have high expectations for young people. We want them to believe that young people can do things like pass Regents exams, which none of the children in New York City take anymore. It was pretty matter of standard course when I was in high school to take Regents. Now kids don't take Regents. The subject matter is so watered down, kids don't really have any relationship to school. So we want teachers to have high expectations for young people, but yet I don't think that the sort of the federal standard of testing, you know, it doesn't say what happens if children fail a test. It doesn't say what's going to change, who's going to. We have had these things come in New York, they come and they go, and you get one set of tests, and then they say 4 years later it's another set. The thing that shook New York City more than anything else when this new chancellor came in was when he went into certain school districts and he said, you know what, these children aren't performing, you're going to lose your job.
You mean Rudy Crew?
Yes, yes. It hadn't happened before. People hadn't heard that before. And I measure chancellors in New York City. We're in public schools. Whatever the chancellor does, I try and see, does it have any impact on those schools in Harlem that I'm in? None of them have ever had an impact. When this chancellor said that, suddenly everybody in school said, wait a second here, now let's rethink this thing, because people suddenly understood that maybe there might be something at stake with whether or not children did good. See, if children don't do good right now, nothing's at stake. Suddenly they thought, you know what, my job might be dependent on these kids performing. It totally changed the motivation in those schools. People suddenly were interested in partnerships in a way they hadn't before. So I'm really interested in sort of what happens with testing when things don't happen and how we get to this level of accountability. I think that's where this thing really matters.
As a retired college professor, I'm tempted to carry on the conversation, but I will restrain myself.
Did you want to respond?
I think you're absolutely right. I think there has to be accountability, there have to be consequences, but right now in Houston, they've made all the principals at-will employees, okay, based upon, and so they've now so much anxiety and so much insecurity, and they are just bouncing around from project to project, from partnership to partnership, from collaboration to collaboration, that they're now, it's like they're like squirrels in a cage running around, and they don't have the time or the energy or the patience to think through anything very, very carefully. So I'm a little nervous. Like I said, in Texas we have the capacity to exaggerate any good idea and undermine it, and so I get real nervous about some of these accountability measures, okay?
Hi, I'm Susan Cardos, a doctoral student here at the School of Education, where they do teach us everything you want to know about collaborative learning, by the way. I have two small unrelated questions. The first one is, can you talk a little bit about some of the problems that the Beacon School program has faced? And the second question is, do you think that a school leader can develop a good school community partnership if the school leader is not from that community?
Jeff, you want to speak to both those?
Let me just answer this first question really quickly. The most complicated piece is really forming relationships with schools. If you're an outside group, the poorest functioning and performing schools in New York City they're the best at keeping outsiders out. That's what they do better than anything else. The kids will fail everything else. But you talk to parents and everybody else and they say, we tried. And I spent 7 months and you know what? They just wear you down and after a while people just walk away and they throw their hands up. Forming relationships where they actually work is really, I think, the most difficult part of forming a beacon school, because the idea is to really bring an outside agency inside that public school building during the day, after school, and evenings, and really change those schools from something that's owned and run by the Board of Education as something that the Board of Education is in for part of the day, but we're actually in the school much longer than the Board of Education is in terms of the time that we stay there. And I think that is just complicated, difficult work inside almost any public education. Just very quickly on the issue of can an outsider from outside the community, I'll give you a good example of what happened. We had this terrible, terrible problem on 144th Street where our Beacon School is located. And they called me in. There were some guys on the block, and they were absolutely furious. They were talking about they were going to bring guns, and they were going to come and shut the program down. So I came in, and they started getting on me. You haven't hired anybody from the community. We don't understand how you think you're going to walk in here and get these jobs and not. And I looked at the guys. I was dumbfounded. I said, what are you talking about? The whole staff here comes from Harlem. They said, no one's from 144th Street, right? And they meant this. Now, this was community to them, and we hadn't got there, right? And we got there real quick. That, you know, that is a real funny sliding scale. Now, they didn't care where I was from, right? They were looking at jobs and where those jobs were going, who was going. And they said, here on this block, we have not benefited from this school being here. And so that was a wake-up call for us. We said, well, we're going to hire some of you folks from this block because that's real. I think that's the kind of stuff that makes it real. This wasn't about where I'm from, whether I lived in Harlem and I was right. This was how the community felt about their 2, 3, 4 blocks that they consider their community and who was in there and who had the power in there. And that's really negotiating at that level, I think, really takes a person who's willing to give and take more so than whether you live in that block or you don't.
Anybody else want to comment on that?
Good afternoon. My name is Patrice Ford. I'm a master's student here at the Kennedy School in Public Policy. I'm very interested in organizational development, specifically of youth-serving agencies, the same agencies that would be in the community with schools. My concern is funding and funding for these agencies, and I'd like anybody, specifically Mr. Canada, to speak to innovative strategies that young nonprofit organizations, those with people with wonderful hearts, great ideas, fulfilling services, can have a multi-year. How do you develop mission if you don't know if you're going to have $1,000 versus $25,000? And specifically, if you could look at government nonprofit partnerships, business, and private nonprofit partnerships.
I think that there's some other folks who can probably speak to that too. I think if for young people who really want to enter this field, that they have to partner with someone who's done this work. Any of us who have to raise money on a regular basis for these organizations know that we spend most of our time doing that. And it is part art and part science, right, in terms of how this stuff is done. And you really need to come, and the science part we can talk about, but you have to see the art. And I tell people that's a little bit like watching people make sausage. It's not the prettiest thing you ever want to see. You have to go out here and raise money on a regular basis. And I'll just give you an example. I really believe that organized sports is absolutely terrific for young people in communities. I think it's just great if you get good coaches and they care about girls and boys and that kind of stuff. But it's one of the most difficult things to fund. And so if you saw me on one of my tours and you came into my gym, and I'd be telling me, go into the class, and they say, what are they doing there? Oh, the kids are working on the computers. We're preparing them for employment. Say, oh, I get that, I get that. They walk in the gym, say, what are they doing here? I say, oh, the kids are working on their gross motor skills, you know. The kids are playing basketball. They're having a great time, right? But they don't want to fund that. So you have to sort of talk in a way that you feel like people are going to fund. I think that's the sausage part, right? And you look at me and say, wow, Jeff, you do that for a living? Yeah, so I think this is really about partnering. There are some strategies that can be taught and that can be learned. Part of it is really sticking to this thing and not giving up. A lot of us have found that, you know, you go under real quick. And if you can just sort of be around long enough to sort of get a sort of an established presence, then you can often break through. I tell people a lot of it is spending time going out and doing things you have no interest in doing, right? But you feel like maybe there might be some additional support for your agency if you do that. So I don't know if anybody.
Anybody else want to comment on
My name is Andrew Clark. I'm also in the master's program here at the Kennedy School. My question, I guess, is more probably for Mr. Cortez and maybe Ms. Buckney. I'm interested in the children's attitude towards our education, and I was kind of interested in what your opinion was on what the relationship of the attitudes of the children in the school towards learning and how important that is towards the academic achievement of the children in the school, and how your reform efforts affect the learning attitudes and how the changes in learning, if any, are brought about in the reform efforts.
Well, I think kids will do well according to 3 sets of expectations. The expectations of their parents, the expectations of their teachers, and their own expectations of how well they can do. And so I think it's real important that that kids, that particularly kids in low income and low performing schools, be challenged to have a different set of expectations. But I don't think that's going to happen just by exhorting or by screaming at kids. I think you're going to have to kind of model that and show them different ways of learning, and it's going to have to require a lot of mentoring. One of the stories that kind of tells me a little bit about that is that my wife used to work as a librarian in Austin, one of the Austin schools, and one of the leaders from that particular community was real active in making sure that library was providing services and working for the Alliance School to make sure that they had the after-school enrichment programs. And she came into the library, and my wife was kind of teasing her and chastising her that if she didn't behave and didn't turn in the books, that they were going to close the school down. I mean, the library down, excuse me. And she said, no, Mrs. Cortez, my mother would never let this library shut down, okay? And I think the fact that young girl had that kind of attitude, and it was basically because she would watch her mother, okay, participating actively in going to the school board, participate actively in going to the city council, organizing house meetings, and that just developed a whole different attitude about what she could do, okay, by watching her mother do those kind of things. I've seen whole communities in El Paso. Howard Gardner came to a school in El Paso, Texas, and listened on the microphones while the parents talked about assessment, okay, in Spanish, okay, because it was a monolingual Spanish-speaking school, and he was impressed by their capacity to understand sophisticated concepts of assessment and be able to weigh and consider why different schools were assessing kids in different kinds of ways. Well, the fact that parents develop those different perspectives, those different insights, that carries over into the kids, because then there's a different set of conversations that take place around the dinner table, a different set of conversations that take place when parents walk their kids to school, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
I certainly agree with my colleague here. One of the things I would like to say is as you deal with children and you see them going to school for that kindergarten year, that first grade year, one of the things after they get through with that separation anxiety is that they are totally enthralled with the education process. They come home, they're excited, they're learning something, they have all kinds of things to show that they have done, they've accomplished, they've learned things they didn't know they were capable of learning. Somewhere along the way, by the time we get to 3rd grade, they are really bored with school. Something happens to diminish that enthusiasm. Part of it is how we teach children, and all of a sudden by 3rd, 4th grade, we're now making sure they sit in the rows and they put their name on the paper in a certain order, and if they do it different than that, then my God, you have hell to pay. They have to make sure they answer the questions in such a manner, and the creativity is stifled. If you want children to remain enthusiastic about school and going to school and learning, you have to have that parent support, encouraging them, but you also have to have teachers who understand that you must keep challenging them have good experiences. If you did something every day and were totally marked off as wrong and negative and had, these red check marks, I used to refuse to allow my teachers to have red in their classrooms. This was crayon on, for the picture of the sun rising or something. It was just devastating to children, especially at the early grades. So the more that you keep that encouragement up and keep it creative and innovative, the more you'll have that enthusiasm.
This needs to be the last question.
Gosh, I didn't know I'd be the last question. My name is Willis Terry. I'm a former superintendent of schools in Maine, where in rural schools, a very different situation. We have easier chance of bringing the community in. For the last few years, I've been working as a consultant across the river here in a small neighborhood town known as Boston. Boston has a different problem in that, as you all know, a number of years ago, they introduced busing. So we no longer have neighborhood schools. And I would love you to address the question about how do we develop this intersection of the community and the schools if you don't have that kind of neighborhood.
Who's game for that?
I'll go for part of the question, but then I would like to be excused because I do have to catch a
No,
plane.
I understand.
We had the same problem in Austin, sort of, okay? And, for example, what happened was the Zavala kids would have to be bused an hour and a half to go to middle school once they finished, and then bused an hour and a half back. Now, they were doing poorly when they went to the middle school because of that problem. So we did two things. The organization forced the school district to pay for the parents to be bused, okay, to the middle school, so the parents could be part of that communities of learners at the middle school. But more importantly, what they developed was a Zavala Alumni Association, okay? And that is Zavala, so one of the most creative things I see going on in Zavala and some of the other Alliance schools is that teachers, we were able to organize and get the Texas legislature to put aside a pot of money for Alliance schools. And what Zavala is doing with their $50,000 discretionary dollars is they're hiring teachers, and some of them are volunteering as well, to teach after school, after they teach in the elementary school. So they're tutoring kids who went to the middle school, who are being bused and coming back. They come back now to Zavala. So if you go to Zavala at the time school's ending, you'll see about 20 kids coming back on a bus, okay, to Zavala, going into the library and being tutored by Zavala teachers and parents, okay. And as a result of that, these kids are beginning to do much better. So I think there are creative ways to do that, okay. Frankly, I think, there's a lot to say about that, which I won't say about it because I'll have to pay my disrespect to a lot of people. But I've seen one of the worst examples of school reform is in Kansas City, where you don't have school, because of the reform strategy, there's no possibility of creating any kind of communities of learners connected to place or geography.
Please join me in thanking the panel for a very stimulating and wonderful discussion.
It was really a pleasure. You did very well. Thank you.